This program is brought to you by Emory University.
On September 23, 2015, the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence at Emory University presented a workshop titled Rewriting is the Essence of Writing. This session covered good practices and techniques for revising and editing your own work, what to look for, how to read and listen to your work, habits and patterns common to scholarly writing. This podcast of the session is led by Allison Adams, Associate Director of the CFDE and an editor for 25 years, along with Hank Klibanoff, the James M. Cox Professor of Journalism, co-author of The Race Beat, The Press, the Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation, and winner of the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in History.
So I thought we'd start with some words from one of my favorite teachers on writing. If you don't own this book, it's actually on the list of recommended resources, and I suggest you have a copy in your library. It's called On Writing Well. It's one of the classic texts on writing. William Zinsser's central message in this book is what you see here. Rewriting is the essence of writing well. It's where the game is won and lost. And I also just wanted to read a couple of other things that he has to say. What do I mean by rewriting? I don't mean writing one version and then writing a whole new version from scratch and then a third, which is a relief, right? Most rewriting consists of reshaping and polishing the raw material you wrote on your first try. This means that a certain amount of your typing has already been done. So there's some good news in that. He says that revisions are really matters of carpentry, fixing the structure and the flow, that most rewriting is a process of juggling elements that already exist. And he's not just talking about polishing individual sentences, although that's pretty important, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The construction is equally important. So he suggests that you read your article aloud from beginning to end and put yourself in the reader's mind. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that as well. So there is good news in that, right? Some people do this, and I don't think it works for everybody, but it certainly works for me. It's a way of just getting what's in your brain out on paper, a brain dump. We don't need to be perfect in the first draft. It's free to be messy and incomplete, and you can write in half sentences, you can be ungrammatical, you can write sideways on the page or upside down. Sometimes my notes go all the way around the edge of the page. So really, it's a conversation between yourself and your subject and your work. And I think that's a much easier, less stressful way to think about it, that you don't have to be perfect on the first time.
I would only add to that, I don't find it effective to do the brain dump myself, but I completely understand that some people do. I think I find that overwhelms me, that I've suddenly just taken everything I know and put it out there, and I would rather write it in somewhat of an organized fashion. But I think I have caused myself a lot of long and grievous nights because of that.
One way or the other, you're going to have a couple of those, I think. So I really think that as you are thinking about the process of revising and rewriting, that your best friends really are time and distance. Write and then leave it alone for a little while. And it's amazing what you'll see when you come back to it. Give it a day, give it a day and a half, give it longer. Take a walk, go for a run, do some yoga.
Long showers.
There you go. Knit, cook, play tennis. Just do something that isn't writing and get out of your head for a while. And then when you come back to your work, you might say, what was I thinking? Well, don't worry about it, because you're going to rewrite.
No, that's it. I mean, I think time matters. And ideas need time, and good ideas need more time than bad ideas. And it's a gift to yourself to give yourself that time, even if your publisher won't, for that connection to be made. And whether you're working on your own or editing someone else's, sometimes you're just absorbed with it for days, and suddenly in the shower, like I said, literally, you say, "Oh, this is how we connect these three dots. This is the transition I'm looking for. These are the words." So.
Yeah, another thing, sort of famous line from Zinsser's book here is, clear writing is clear thinking. And this is your opportunity to go back and refine your ideas. That does take time, and you do have to plan for that. And that means procrastination is not your best friend. And if you try to wait until, a day or two before the deadline to get something out on paper, you're going to have a hard time with it, and you aren't going to have that opportunity to really polish and refine and sharpen your ideas and your language. So we thought we'd go over some how-tos, and really I like to divide these things into two stages. One is, the first one, you really want to look at the big picture, the work from 30,000 feet, right? And this is where sort of putting yourself in the position of the reader is helpful. You can imagine yourself as an outsider who's never read this piece before and ask yourself, does it pull you through? Does it make you want to read more and read all the way through to the end? And if not, how can you change the structure? Did you bury the lead? Is the basic information on page 18? If that's the case, then you need to get it on page 1, and you need to make sure that it's compelling and that the argument holds together and that the point is clear and succinct and that the logic flows. And one effective exercise is when you hit on something in your rereading that doesn't make sense, that's the point where you can ask yourself how and why you got lost. And that's probably where you really need to focus your efforts of tinkering. And sometimes it's helpful to talk through that point with someone else. That might be where a writing buddy or a writing group can come in handy. And I'll just put in an advertisement quickly for the CFDE. Some of you are in the writing groups that we have organized. But we will put out a call probably next month for the new set of cohort of writing groups to start meeting in January for the semester or for the year, and please feel free to sign yourself up because it can be a great support mechanism for getting that kind of feedback. And Hank, I think you had some thoughts the other day about story.
Well,
that stage of things.
Yes, let me. I will say that, but let me. I can't say with enough emphasis how important it is to detach oneself from what they've just spent a lifetime researching in order to make sense to someone who hasn't spent 10 minutes researching what you've been devoting your life to. It becomes imperative to detach, and it's painful to detach. But it becomes imperative because you're writing for an audience. You're the translator of information. And unless you can find the way to clearly simplify, and I may be getting ahead of where we're going to go on this, but unless you can do it in that way that you can freely and quickly identify that one sentence in the middle that makes no sense to anybody, and they won't understand, it's a reference to some higher thought that you had, and it might impress 12 people in the field, and we do want to impress those 12, but you will have lost the 99% who don't know what you're talking about. It's funny that we as teachers can read our student papers and very quickly identify those sentences that are DOA, and actually mislead people. They send the ambulance away, okay, rather than move the reader forward. The trick is to be able to identify it for yourself at that point. The story idea is that, I just think you're always looking for the story. You're looking to tell stories here. I realize we're dealing sometimes with very difficult, complicated academic matters, and you will decide who your audience is. And if it is an academic audience and that's all you care about, then maybe you don't have to tell as many stories. But I think that if you're looking for a broader audience, that's what you're doing. Now, you've heard this before 100 times. But it means being committed to it from beginning to end, that it's not just a little bit. And what happens, I think, is we start typing the story, and then we say, oh gosh, this is ridiculous, I'm not good at this, and fall back to the middle, to the default of just sort of plain, not necessarily dull, but clear, but not necessarily compelling expository writing. And that just takes courage, I think, to say, I'm going to just do this. I'm going to step outside my head. I'm no longer who I think I am, and I'm going to write like people I admire when they tell stories. I'm getting ahead.
No, I think it's true, and it's also true that you have devoted your life and career to whatever topic you're writing on for a reason, and that is that you're passionate about it and it's compelling to you. And if you can carry that into your writing, there is a story there, and there is something that you can say about it that is going to be compelling to other people. There's a reason there, and you just have to find it and be able to articulate it. And it's really where the conversation really starts. Please don't, at this stage, get bogged down in tinkering with commas, because you'll get to that later. You really are sort of having that larger moment of perspective. And so don't be afraid to change your thesis or in light of something that you've discovered as you did that initial write. Reconsider your argument, take another look at your evidence, refine your purpose, reorganize. Don't take cause and effect for granted. Make sure that those things are clear in your writing. Check your conclusions. Be clear about what you were discovering and revealing. Pay attention to the transitions from one idea to the next throughout. I mean, sometimes that's one paragraph to the next. Sometimes that's one section, one chapter to the next. So, you know, this is your opportunity to sort of clear the flotsam and jetsam out of your thinking and make sure it's clear.
Now, I don't come, you should know I don't come from an academic background. And as a result, I have been nothing but awed by the people I've met since I've come here to Emory. And I'm just astonished by the brilliance of the people I meet. And yet I have had no small number come to me and talk to me about writing, because they don't feel like they know what I mean when we talk about telling stories. They're just translating complicated matter to their own audience. I could be wrong, but I think that there's a training in the academy that is a very defensive training. You know, you come up with a theory, an idea, and your whole idea is to claim that turf, as you should, and to discredit anybody else around there. And I don't mean necessarily personally discredit, but no one's ever done this and no one's done that. And after a while, you've got whatever that turf is, and sometimes it's gotten smaller and smaller, and the smaller it gets, the more you defend it, okay? But my point is that when you start to write, you have to let that defensiveness go, in my view, for public scholarship, for public audiences. That's maybe not for journals. Maybe that's appropriate there, but I'm thinking more for public, right? And that's a mind shift, that I'm not going to be defensive, I'm not going to discredit, I'm not arguing with anybody, I'm telling a story. I love my subject, and I'm going to put every bit of passion into my subject to advance it in as clear a fashion as I can.
Your voice should be defined by your ideas and your perspective. And this is a question that I think is helpful to work through with a good editor. But I think that you'll help yourself if you really remember as you're going through the writing and revising process that what matters in your work is your voice first. So let's say that you've gotten your ideas down on paper, you've made one rough draft, and then you've taken some time to go back and reread it multiple times. And that's another piece of advice that's, I think, in the PowerPoint that I want to hit on. Don't try to read for everything at one time, because then you'll just confuse yourself. Read multiple times with multiple questions that you want to answer with every pass. And so you've taken the time to do that, you've gotten your work down, you've left it for a day or two, you've come back to it, you've done another pass, you've made some changes, you've rearranged things, you've made your argument, you've made it again, you've polished, and then you've left it for another day or two, and then you've come back to it for another pass. You've gone through those stages, and now you're ready for the nitty-gritty. Now, this is where you are getting down to the sentence level, and you really want to try to say, does this word really mean what I want it to mean? Do you know from your past writing what some of your patterns are? Sometimes when you give something to someone else to read and they say, boy, you really used that construction, it is and there are and there were an awful lot. See if you can work that out of your writing. Those are things to look for. So experience might be your teacher here. What have you done in the past that you have a tendency to do, these little verbal crutches that you might fall on? Read for those next. Therefore, thusly is my favorite one. Thus therefore, thusly. One of those are a couple that drive me crazy. That said is another one that we see a lot in academic writing. Semicolons. People in academic writing love the semicolons. It's just a way of making two perfectly good short sentences much longer than they need to be. Read for jargon. You should take out as much jargon as you can, and if you just can't because it's a standard term in your field, explain what you mean. And you might need to explain it more than once. Read for redundancies. Do you unnecessarily say the same thing over and over again? You might not need to say it so many times. Check for accuracy. Check for misleading statements, misinformation, vagueness. Does this word mean what you think it means? And here's a point at which Hank and I diverged slightly. I say, look for those long, complicated sentences and make them shorter. Hank says there's a place in the world for long, complicated sentences.
Long sentences, not complicated. Long rhythmic sentences. I love reading a writer, and I love being a writer who just sort of catches the wave and just keeps going and turns it, and you just pray to God that it works. And you can find very quickly if it doesn't. I mean, you can show it around, and somebody says, well, but That might be a long sentence may be a good one to hold up to that test of, am I getting lost? Am I getting bored? Am I getting distracted? And if you are, then reconsider the long sentence. But he's right. I mean, there's a way you can break up the rhythm of a passage by, if you have a bunch of short sentences, throwing in a long one that really sort of carries you through might be a very elegant and graceful way to fix a problem. I think it also has to have purpose. I mean, the one time I can think of, and I did it at the very first sentence of a piece, but the piece was about the Mississippi River. I thought that was appropriate,
This stage of rewriting is really about reviving stale prose, not just fixing technical difficulties, although that's important, but, simplify and clarify. Cecilia Cancelera, who is an editor who was here to talk to us a couple of years ago, said to focus your efforts on beginnings, on introductions, first lines, first paragraphs, first chapters, because that's usually where you gain or lose a reader. Look at the where you're going to engage someone or lose them. I was thinking as I was working through this presentation that my career was mostly in print, and the thing about print is that there really is a word limit. It's not like the web where you can go on and there's nothing to stop you, like the end of a page. And you really, it was a form of discipline that you had to write within 800 words or 1,000 words. And if you went over, there was no room for those extra words, so you really did have to get rid of them. And usually the result was better writing. So I still think that imaginary exercise of thinking, well, I don't have any more room than this number of words or this number of pages is a good one. It's a good thing for your writing.
On the semicolon, I just sort of brought to mind when you remember Son of Sam when he was out killing people in New York, and he was writing letters to Jimmy Breslin at the New York Daily News. And I remember Breslin was getting these letters and writing his columns about him, and then he says, I tell you, he may be a killer, but the son of a gun knows how to use a semicolon.
Okay, so I guess the lesson is avoid the semicolon unless you are a serial
right.
killer.
That's right.
Serial semicolonist.
That's right. Pay attention to your to the patterns and your bad habits. I don't know. I can't emphasize that enough either. That's again, it's a mantra from a newsroom. After a while, if you see that you began every sentence, or everything, it was a dark and stormy. It, they, and no one knows who they is. It really becomes important. There was a writer I worked with at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and boy, was he terrific. I mean, he was out there. He was seeing the nitty-gritty of life, covering public housing and inside these, terrible stories. And I noticed that so many of his stories would sort of die about 3/4 of the way through. They would just sort of become flabby and this, that, and the other, And then I started noticing that his paragraphs did the same thing, okay? And then I said, let's go further. Let's look at his sentences. And his sentences would do that. And we went and had what I'm sure he thought was the strangest editor-reporter discussion he'd ever had in his life. He couldn't believe that there was an analysis of his writing down to the sentence level, but it was true. He's now on the masthead of the New York Times, by the way. You know, not because of that. I'm just saying he was, no. But he was, but I'm just saying there are patterns where we do things that are these tics. If you see yourself turning to adverbial excess, and suddenly using adverbs, what does that mean? It means you're trying to overtell and you're not showing. You know that, and it will show. It is spackle on a wall. You're short on the reporting, you don't have enough data, so you use an adverb to sort of try to spackle over what you don't know, and anyone can see that hole there, okay? So sometimes that's all you can do because it's too late to go back and do more research, do more reporting, but you have to find some way to either dance around it or fill it in, so.
So I wanted to say a little bit more about reading something aloud for yourself. It's going to feel a little strange when you're sitting in a room alone, or perhaps other people are there, reading something that you've just written aloud. But there are some things that can come out of that, and I just wanted to share this passage from Peter Elbow. Peter Elbow is another excellent advisor on writing, especially in the world of academic writing, and his book is also recommended on that list. This is what he says: look for places where you stumble or get lost in the middle of a sentence. These are the obvious awkwardnesses that need fixing. Look for places where you get distracted or even bored, where you cannot concentrate. These are places where you probably lost focus or concentration in your writing. Cut through the extra words or vagueness or digression. Get back to the energy. Listen even for the tiniest jerk or stumble in your reading. Yes, the tiniest lessening of your energy or focus or concentration as you say the words. A sentence should be alive. It's a lot of work, but it is absolutely worth it, and it does get easier as you learn to do it with your own writing.
This is where it's worth channeling the words of a great American who we lost last night, Yogi Berra, who said, "You can observe a lot just by watching." So watch your words and watch your sentences and watch your paragraphs, and you can observe a lot.
And listening to yourself. So let's say we've made a couple of passes looking for big picture things. You've made another few passes of restructuring smaller things, sentence level stuff. And remember that as you're doing this, you're not necessarily stopping and getting stuck, as in you see a problem and you're not going to necessarily stop and fix it right then and there. You're going to bracket it or highlight it or flag it in some way and come back to it later. And I really want to emphasize that doing this gives you a kind of momentum through your work as you're making multiple passes. So don't get stuck. If you see something that you say, oh my gosh, this is such a problem, I'm gonna have to fix this, and you can either spend a lot of time fixing it because you've got the solution right there in front of you, or you can say, okay, I'm gonna have to come back to that and flag it, move on, and then come back around on your next pass. There's no hard and fast rule, but if you don't have a solution right then and there, you don't feel inspired, you don't have an idea in your head about what to do, move on and come back to it, because again, that revisiting later on, you might have done some unconscious work on it and you'll come back to it and it'll be there. So on that last pass, revisit everything that you flagged, fix the big picture things first, right? The organization and structure. You don't want to fix sentences that you might cut 5 days later. That's a waste of time, right? And honestly, it's so easy to get engaged in that granular level stuff in order to avoid fixing the big things, only to realize later, oh my gosh, this argument doesn't hold water and I've got to completely revise it, okay? So, I want to say something about your audience. Hank said a little bit about, the differences between academic writing and the writing of a journalist, but I had actually, it was someone here on the faculty who was my thesis advisor when I was a graduate student say, when she wrote, she always wrote for her mother. Her mother is a public librarian in Massachusetts. She's bright and educated and curious and reads a lot of things and meets a lot of interesting people and is just engaged in the world and wants to know about things. And so I write for her mother. I'm like, yeah, that's a pretty good audience. I want to write for her too. But she's not an academic, and that's important to me, to be able to write in a way that appeals to the curious mind, but doesn't dumb things down. So you're not writing for an audience of 4. There are only 4 people in the world who are going to understand this. But you are writing for someone who is very interested and curious about the world.
Yes, one thought would be, and this would be just more of a personal experience I had when I was writing the race beat, and I had basically a 900-page manuscript typed. It came out to be 530 pages in publication, but pretty dense. Not the reading, the type. It might be dense reading too. But at one point, it was divided into, I think, 12 chapters. And I knew the chapters were just too long. I just hadn't subdivided it really well. But I had put that off and put that off. Let's wait till we have the total picture here. And then we got to the end, and with my co-author, I called him up and I said, I think we need to divide this into a lot more chapters. And he says, I agree, let's do it. And I mean, we spent hours and hours on the phone. This is a guy who didn't use a computer during the 12 years we worked on this book, okay? Nor did my editor at Knopf use a computer. It was all typewriter, okay? But finally, and so I'm crafting new endings to every chapter and new beginnings. New endings, new beginnings, trying to somewhat cliffhanger stuff. I read Hardy Boys, ending every paragraph, little did he know he would see that face again, that kind of thing. And you build drama. And so I'm doing all that, and then at some point I'm looking at the beginnings of all of my chapters, and I found myself bored to tears. I thought, oh my Lord, what is it? And I realized that every chapter I was resetting a scene from the civil rights movement, a scene from Birmingham or from Ole Miss or from Selma or something, and there wasn't a journalist in sight. And my book is about the news coverage of civil rights. I thought, you're missing the whole point. You're missing the whole point. If every chapter doesn't begin with a reporter or some journalistic moment high up, that's what's distinctive. It may not be good, but at least that's what sets the book apart from all the other bookshelves full of civil rights books. So I just made a commitment to rewrite every one to make sure that there was some journalistic thing happening there at the beginning of each chapter.
And I think that actually goes back to your earlier question about, how do you set your message and your story apart from all the others out there without, saying, well, this is different from so-and-so because of X, and this is different from this other person because of Y.
You're just doing it.
Yeah, just tell the story.
Right.
And, if you feel at a certain point that you've got to say, this is where my research diverges from the work of others, do that later on. You don't have to make it a lead.
You can do it in notes to the reader later.
Absolutely.
You can do it in footnotes.
Yeah.
There are a million places to do it that don't impair the reader's opportunity to really enjoy reading what you're writing.
And oppress your own voice.
So when I got to the end, I thought, I don't remember what's where anymore. I don't know if I've repeated myself. This is written from the 1930s to the 1960s. There's a lot of characters, a lot of players. And some people I don't introduce until later, and then flash back, and then bring them forward. All these sorts of things. And I just pulled out I went through and just using the search mode, everything about the Hederman family that owned the newspapers in Jackson, Mississippi, I pulled out and just listed. And it's about 15 pages of just everything I've said about them. Everything I wanted to say about the Southern Education Reporting Service and their Southern School News that was published in the South in the 50s and 60s. I just printed out and pulled it out. And so I went through reading every one of those and found a number of redundancies and times when I was over-explaining about things. And it really helped me see, because otherwise it would be quite normal to lose track of what you've already said.
Yeah, especially in a long book-length project, it's hard to stay sort of onto the spine of the idea, and you've got to ask, what's not necessary to the telling of this tale, then close the gates to things that are going to go off on a wild diversion. And what's
That's for the
what's
journal.
relevant?
I'll do a journal article on that one.
Yeah.
Right.
What's trivial? What's irrelevant? Just make every single word count. And again, that fresh perspective, if there are a couple of chapters that you haven't read in a while because you're working on something else, now may be the time to go back to them with a fresh eye and say, there's a lot here that I don't need to have here. And figure out what those are. And, sometimes it means revising your argument to match who you've discovered in your writing. Sometimes it means to come up with stronger arguments or better illustrations to make your point. Sometimes it means rearranging things to help the reader follow your argument. Sometimes it means taking things out. And occasionally it might mean adding something for balance or emphasis or explanation, but chances are you've already got that in there. You just need to put it somewhere else. None of these activities obviate the need for an editor. And at some point, you are really going to need someone to look at and to see things that you, as the author, you've been long immersed in this work, and you just can't see them. And that also doesn't mean that you won't ever need a proofreader, because a proofreader can see things that an editor misses.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University. Please visit us at emory.edu.